Hey guys, Faraday here. So today I wanted to make a video addressing some of the criticism that I received on my last video where Nick Fuentes has been having his groypers go into TPUSA events and causing a lot of disruption, asking a lot of very edgy, controversial questions, and causing the conservatives to kind of go into a frenzy. Now, I said some things in that video that were apparently untrue, and then apparently I got the timeline a little mixed up. Now, the timeline I'm not super concerned about because my audience isn't super concerned about that event. We just kind of want the rough overdraft. But one of the things that I said in there that apparently was not true is that Nick Fuentes is a white nationalist. Apparently, Nick Fuentes disavows white nationalism and does not consider himself a white nationalist. And despite me knowing that Nick is half Latino, I could have swore that he was a white nationalist, to be honest with you. That's kind of the problem with these far-right groups now, is the overlap between them becomes so blurred that it becomes hard to tell who's who. And then
wrong answer.
Warning initiating beatdown mode. Warning initiating beatdown mode. Warning initiating beatdown mode.
You know, he kind of has a point, and I could kind of see like how it could get complicated with people sometimes. You know, maybe if we had some kind of guy who used to be a part of these ideologies and was like really deep into it and was on the inside, you know, and then got out of it and had all the inside information and all the details about how these groups work. If only we had that guy, you know, maybe we could figure some of this stuff out.
Who's who. And then on top of that, a lot of these groups, a lot of the people within these movements are just straight up liars and they're not honest about their positions in the first place. I mean, one only needs to look at the recent stream on Adam Friended and PSA Sitch where No Bullshit came on and try to tell people that he'd never heard of the alt-right, white nationalism wasn't a real thing, and that he's never been a white nationalist or alt-right or alt-light. And for anybody that hasn't seen that stream, I suggest go checking it out.
Now, if you're expecting him to give any more examples other than No Bullshit, then you know, I hate to tell you, but there aren't any. No Bullshit, the guy who makes mundane Matt tier anti-SJW clickbait stuff, and that's his example for, you know, people who are lying about their ideology in the alt-right. A guy who still makes anti-SJW content bullshit.
It out. Now, of course, Nick does talk about wanting the country to remain majority European. Demographic shifts are undeniably something that he talks about all the time, and it was one of the main questions asked during the TPUSA events. Now, of course, the question becomes, do those demographic shifts really matter? Now, I'm sure if you're afraid of people voting Democrat, sure, I guess that's an existential threat to you. But in terms of the country actually falling apart because we have non-white people coming in, I'm just going to call bullshit on that. If you've ever spent time in minority communities, you're going to know that these aren't like the destitute, horrible conditions that everybody tries to make them out to be. Of course there's problem communities. Of course there's crime-ridden communities. And of course, you know, there's always going to be problems with this in terms of immigration. And these are problems we have to work on. But for the most part, when you meet immigrants, they're hardworking people. They contribute a lot to the country in terms of culture, in terms of labor. It's a net gain on GDP. And if you're worried about the kind of after effects of that, well, then that's why we need good taxation to redistribute the gains from some of these companies that benefit from immigration the most.
No, again, he just threw out about a million fucking things without any citation whatsoever. It's like, oh, you think migrants cause more crime? Well, you're wrong. There you go. But then he sort of does admit that they do commit more crime, and yeah, we need to work on that. Well, how's about just better migration policy? Would that be an option? And then he goes on to explain, and this is actually like what he brought up was an interesting point, but what he does is he frames it to make it sound like it's a good thing. And that is that the big companies are using mass migration to bring in cheap labor. Yeah, maybe it does help the GDP, but that's like the bottom line for the big companies and how much money they're pulling in because they're bringing in cheap labor. I mean, think about the fact that you never hear about people being able to raise a family off of a 40-hour factory job anymore. People just work their asses off like 40 hours a week just to barely be able to scrape by in a one-bedroom apartment. But you think it's a good thing that we flood in all of these migrants for cheap labor because that'll help the GDP. You don't think that'll be a problem. We just need to find a way to get these companies to redistribute the wealth better. But how's about just not treating the fucking populations like we're a bunch of fucking maggot cattle, pieces of shit, that are just there for no other reason, just for the GDP. We're just like a bunch of walking numbers. We're not human beings with a heritage and a culture and race. We're just a bunch of ants for the GDP. How's about just doing away with that bullshit? Would that be too much to ask for? That we be treated like actual human beings?
Now, to me, a lot of these quote-unquote distinctions between the groypers and the alt-right inevitably are just irrelevant. When you're looking at a group of people that spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, when you're looking at a figurehead like Fuentes, which goes on his show and tells Holocaust denial jokes, I don't see the big difference between them and the alt-right. I really don't. Why? Because they're not self-proclaimed white nationalists, because they're not out and out about it.
So you say people who spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Why don't you explain that? Like, what does that even mean? Like saying that this certain group of people have a lot of money influence in our political elections, would that be considered an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? Why don't you explain that? Better yet, why don't you do a video debunking these theories? That would be really funny to see you do that. And plus, you think that having questions about a historical event is the same thing as wanting to round up all the minorities and kick them out for an ethno-state. You see where I'm getting at there. Can you use your brain to understand why that's fucking retarded? They're throwing old ladies in jail in Germany because they had questions about aspects of a historical event. So let's demonize them as racist monsters and just talk a bunch of shit that you have no idea what you're talking about. Give some kind of context instead of immediately jumping on your moral high horse about subjects that you obviously have no idea what the fuck you're talking about.
You are racially aware. So I was wondering, what is your position on what constitutes your identity and what constitutes the best form of identitarianism that a society can pursue right now?
Sure, that's a great question. I was talking about that earlier today because, of course, there was a big hit piece about me in Right Wing Watch by Jared Holt. We're all a big fan of Jared Holt around here because I attended the American Renaissance Conference this weekend. And the reason I wouldn't call myself a white nationalist, it's not because I don't see the necessity for white people to have a homeland and for white people to have a country. It's because I think that kind of terminology is used almost exclusively by the left to defame. And I think the terminology and the labels that we use, I don't think we can look at them outside of the context of their connotations in America. Whereas maybe it might be descriptive to call somebody a white nationalist. I think it sort of loses something when an average person hears that and it's almost synonymous with Nazi or villain or whatever. And so I would say I'm a white person. I'm conscious of my white identity, conscious of nationalism. But I think in a way it's almost redundant to say that you're a white nationalist. We know that the word nation almost implicitly talks about ethnicity and biology. If you go back to the history of the word, a nation is not synonymous with country or state. Nation itself means a people. So I think if I call myself a nationalist, it's almost implicit in that word that it's, America does have a heritage of being a European country. So that a little bit about the wording, because I know a lot of people would be confused by that, but that's really how I see myself.
The only thing you actually get from that clip is that he is a racially conscious white person. That doesn't mean he doesn't want to allow any non-white people into the country, or that he wants to kick out and not allow any unwhite people in his country at all. That's kind of a leap. If you understand Nick Fuentes' views and you actually know what you're talking about, you'll understand that his points on the racial issues is that it's not a big problem that we have minorities in the country. The problem is that we have a migration agenda that floods in a way that it alters the demographic of the country. And more, and you can deny this all you want and be full of shit about it as much as you want, but left mass media outlets admit to it, that the white population is going down, white birth rates are going down, and we are more and more flooding in people from non-white countries. And maybe you don't see it as a problem, and maybe you do see it as a problem. It's still happening. Just look at the term that the UN calls it, replacement migration. That's the term that the UN uses for it. And the justification that's always used by outlets like CNN, for example, is always that, oh well, we've gotta refill the aging populations, which of course we all know they're talking about white people, and we gotta flood in more people to replace the aging populations so that we can raise the GDP, because of course we all know they're bringing in cheap labor to replace us. We're just a bunch of goyim cattle who need to be replaced when we don't fill a quota. How do you feel being treated like that? Is that fucking okay? And again, going back, oh, you proved that he's racially conscious. So is like 90% of the black community. I mean, that's okay. That's great. You wanna intermarry and fulfill and live by your heritage. Why is that a bad thing? You have Greek communities and Polish communities that are very close knit, and like their neighborhoods are literally like Polish and Greek communities. That's okay. That's not a bad thing. You want to have your own communities. You want to preserve your heritage. That's not a bad thing. And so when people like Nick Fuentes see the migration trends that are going on and see that it is in fact changing the demographic of the country, and you see that as a problem, well, maybe it is. That's a valid criticism.
So to me, I don't see why these distinctions matter at all. We saw the same thing with the alt-right. They came out talking about how they're not white nationalists, they're not white supremacists, they're just identitarians, and they just want to talk about the issues, and they just want a place for white people, and they just, all this bullshit, all this nonsense. And so I'm not really buying it from the Groypers either. We saw the same thing with the alt-right. They tried to dress themselves up as identitarians and the true egalitarians, and they tried to play the optics game too, throwing on suits.
Now, even though you were, totally into alt-right and you knew all about this stuff, I'm going to have to explain to you the history of like when the alt-right sort of came about. You had a handful of people who really were genuinely about this stuff that you were just describing. Like, Mark Collette, for example, or David Duke. I know those names are buzzwords that, get thrown around like, ooh, David Duke. Ooh, David Duke. But if you actually listen to them talk, you will see that they are genuinely about what you just described. And it's these people that you're seeing lately that are dropping the alt-right moniker. They're pushing away from the whole the ethno-state, the bullshit. Even Mike Enoch is walking away from the whole ethno-state inner circle bullcrap, and also Richard Spencer seems to be walking away from it himself.
Now, obviously, with the alt-right, this whole fresh coat of paint inevitably peeled off whenever they were faced with Charlottesville. And in the aftermath of that event, they were revealed for who they are. The mask came off. And this perverse form of respectability politics that they've been trying to play, people weren't buying it anymore. People saw right through it. And it's going to happen the same thing with the Groyper movement. You guys are going to be exposed for who you really are. You're going to be exposed for basically anti-Semitic neo-Nazi. And that's basically the ideology that you're revitalizing. You can call it paleoconservatism, you can call it whatever you want, but you're peddling the same conspiracies, the same overlapping beliefs. So I'm not buying it. Nobody I know buys it. And just because Nick doesn't call himself a white nationalist doesn't mean that implicitly he isn't.
I kind of wish you would actually take the time to explain what exactly views you consider white nationalist views. Like, what is a white nationalist? If you actually weren't an asshole and you actually watched this clip objectively, you would understand that this is the point he's getting at. White nationalist, it's a loose term. People, it can mean like somebody who wants to kill all the black people. It can mean someone who has like a small sense of racial identity who just so happens to be white. And you seem to be one of those guys who consider any white person who has any sense of racial identity whatsoever is automatically a white nationalist. It's a loose term that people throw their own definitions on all the time.
Just to close this out, for those of you that are Nickers or Groypers or alt-righters in the chat that are reasonable, and I've seen a couple of you there, right? Like, I'm not going to discredit you guys. For you guys in the chat, I got a couple questions. First of all, do you really buy this branding that Nick's just an American nationalist? Do you really? Look at who Nick associates himself with. He associates himself with groups like the American Identity Movement, which is the rebranding of Identity Europa, which is a neo-Nazi organization which was active at Charlottesville.
So now he's going to go in and ask a bunch of stupid questions. Like, do you really think that Nick Fuentes is not a white nationalist when he's friends with Patrick Casey, who used to be in Identity Europa? Fuck off. Another thing, a lot of people were active at Charlottesville, not just the alt-right. You had a lot of like traditional conservative constitutionalists that were there too. I mean, it wasn't just the alt-right that was there. You know, who cares if they were at Charlottesville?
Do you guys really buy this stuff? Do you really believe this stuff? Or are we going to need a Charlottesville 2.0 where we have another release of Nick going on some crazy rant because you all decided to rally some protest and then someone gets killed? Are we going to need a Charlottesville 2.0 to wake a lot of you groypers up to what you're actually involved in? Or are you guys going to be honest about it? Okay, second question. Do you guys...
Now look how much of just a self-righteous asshole this guy is. Notice how he just sits there and talks to you like you're a 5-year-old. Like he's talking to a fucking retarded 5-year-old with this pure self-righteous tone. And then while he's talking, it's just a bunch of stupid bullshit that he has no idea what he's talking about. Yeah, you talking about that time Charlottesville where that girl died? Are you talking about when that maniac from Antifa with an assault rifle chased a guy into his car, and then in a panic frenzy he rammed into a couple of cars that ended up getting a girl killed? You talking about that time? Though that was totally just like a pre-planned crazy attack from the right-wingers, and it was totally all their fault. There's no responsibility to anybody on the left who showed up unannounced without a license and turned it into a riot. That was all the right's fault. And it's nothing to do with the guy who pulled out an assault rifle and chased the guy to his car, which caused him to jump in his car and leave in a panic frenzy, which led to a car incident which got a girl killed. Oh, just forget all the context, okay? Just let me talk to you like you're a retarded 5-year-old with my bullshit, self-righteous horseshit.
Is it possible to criticize Israel without going in a comment section and posting anti-Semitic slurs, calling people Jew boys, calling people plants by Mossad, and going off on weird 9/11 conspiracies? Is it possible to criticize Israel without engaging in all that stuff?
Is it possible to address Israel without engaging in all this conspiracy theories about 9/11? Why don't you do a video? Why don't you investigate that and debunk it for us? Maybe if you could just debunk all this stuff about these certain group of ethnic people who completely buy out our politicians every election and every midterms. Maybe you could just debunk all that stuff and tell us how that's actually wrong, how the 5 dancing Israelis is actually a myth, and how we're actually all wrong about that. Do a video where you debunk the news story talking about all like the countless number of Israeli spies who were busted around the time 9/11 happened. Do a video for us where you debunk all of that, and maybe you'll save us and de-radicalize us. That would be really funny to see you do that. And then he just goes on. I'm just going to go ahead and end it here, but he goes on and he has some questions for Nick Fuentes. And he goes, why don't you address all the anti-Semitic and mean stuff that people say in your chat? Why don't you sit there and police the 3,000 or so people in your chat, Nick? But when people send him super chats that say stuff in it that they shouldn't say, he refuses to read it. I mean, that in itself sends a message. But he needs to police every little edgy thing that people say in his live chat of like upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 people. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.